Good afternoon. My name is Alana Cadell-Tucky, and I'm the Director of the Office of Environmental Justice at the Department of Environmental Conservation. I'm also the Chair of the state's Climate Justice Working Group. Joining me this afternoon are Samir Ronaday and Tyler Picard, our partners from the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, Alex Dunn from Illume, and other staff from DEC and NYSERDA who will be assisting us. I want to thank everyone for joining us for this education session on the draft disadvantaged communities criteria. The Climate Justice Working Group worked for over the last year and a half developing this criteria for identifying disadvantaged communities to implement the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, or Climate Act, and voted unanimously to release the draft criteria for public comment on December 13th of 2021. The public comment period started on March 9th of this year and will close on July 22nd. Next slide, please. So just to start, today's session is informational only. We're going to be reviewing the criteria that's now open for public comment and providing an overview of our process. This is not a public hearing, and comments will not be entered into the record. Again, this session is an opportunity to review the Climate Justice Working Group process and to ask technical questions. We will have an opportunity to ask questions after the presentation. If you would like to ask a question during the presentation and you are using the online WebEx, please use the chat function on the right-hand side of your screen. Although it's not a hearing, we do want to hear your thoughts. So if you're interested in submitting comments on the draft criteria, we urge you to visit our website, submit via email, or send it to us through US mail. The address would be attention draft DAC DAC comments, New York State DEC, attention Office of Environmental Justice, 625 Broadway, 14th floor, Albany, New York, 12233. We will have this on a slide for folks to see, and we'll show it multiple times throughout the presentation. We'll also be holding public hearings on the draft criteria, and we plan to announce those very soon. Next slide, please. And with that, I'm going to introduce Samir Ronaday from NYSERDA. Samir?
Thanks, Alana. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining this session. My name is Samir Ronaday. I work as a climate justice advisor at the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. My role supports the coordination, outreach, and implementation of New York's Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, or Climate Act for short. Let me provide some background on this law. Passed in 2019, the Climate Act is the nation's most ambitious climate change-related legislation. Its goal is to reduce New York State's greenhouse gas emissions from all human-based or influenced sources by 100% over 1990 levels by the year 2050, with an incremental target of at least a 40% reduction in greenhouse gases by the year 2030. At least 85% of the reductions by 2050 must come from preventing the release of greenhouse gases. The remaining 15% may come from carbon removal projects like conserving soil, growing forests, and restoring wetlands. To keep us on track to meet these goals, the Climate Act also sets targets to phase out the use of fossil fuels in electricity generation and to massively build out our offshore wind and distributed solar resources, increase our energy storage capacity, and become more energy efficient. Implementing the Climate Act will create opportunities to build a better future. And to ensure this work also advances climate justice, the Climate Act mandates that at least between 35 to 40% of the benefits of New York State's spending on clean energy occur in disadvantaged communities. The identification and prioritization of disadvantaged communities in accounting for the benefits of cutting pollution and improving resilience is what makes our Climate Act a transformative law. Next slide, please. A large part of my job is to provide staff support for New York State's Climate Action Council and the Climate Justice Working Group. Both bodies were established by the Climate Act to carry out important functions. The Climate Action Council is working this year to finalize a scoping plan that will provide a framework for how our state will achieve the ambitious greenhouse gas reduction and clean energy requirements and goals that I described on the previous slide. Public comments are being accepted on the draft scoping plan through June 10, and there are hearings scheduled across the state. That topic is separate to the topic we'll be discussing today, but I encourage everyone to learn more about it and participate in that comment period. You can find information on the scheduled public hearings and how to submit comments at climate.ny.gov. Today's session will provide you with the background you need to comment on the draft criteria for disadvantaged communities that was developed by the Climate Justice Working Group. They will finalize the criteria after considering your comments. The working group consists of 13 members, 4 of whom represent the state agencies on the slide, and 9 are from environmental justice organizations, evenly representing rural and both upstate, urban upstate, and downstate areas. Using their experience and expertise, the working group developed draft criteria to guide the implementation of the scoping plan to help achieve climate justice. This is important for many reasons. Climate change will impact everybody, but not everyone will be impacted equally. Climate change is a threat multiplier, so it can exacerbate existing vulnerability and inequality in communities that already face disadvantages due to foundational barriers, such as poverty and the legacy of racial and ethnic discrimination. So for these reasons, and because climate change is such a vast problem that affects our entire economy and society, it is imperative that our approach to solving climate change intentionally uplift communities facing systemic disadvantages and those who will be most impacted by it. When we aim to create a high standard of living for everyone, everyone's standard of living improves. Next slide, please. And now I will throw it back to Alana to provide background on the legislation language that explains the purpose of the disadvantaged community criteria and provides guidance to the working group for how to create it. Alana?
Thanks, Samir. Next slide, please. So the slide that you're seeing now, this shows the section of the Climate Act that outlines the basic definition of disadvantaged communities. As Samir said, the effects of climate change affect us all, but the harms are not equally distributed. Disadvantaged communities bear a disproportionate burden of environmentally related harms, and that can be measured in terms of factors such as health, income, and life expectancy. So the Climate Justice Working Group was guided by the language in this section in identifying disproportionately burdened communities using the data on environmental hazards, public health issues, geography, and socioeconomic factors like race, income, education levels, unemployment rates, and housing conditions in order to develop the draft criteria. So the reason the law requires the consideration of these factors in identifying disadvantaged communities is because they have a direct correlation to the disproportionate environmental burdens that exist due to historical and contemporary discrimination practices, such as redlining, which is a now outlawed practice where federal government excluded Black home buyers from accessing home loan programs that would have made it more affordable to purchase homes in neighborhoods with higher property values and healthier environments. To show how the effects of this practice continue to affect communities today, if you were to take a map of our state showing where major air pollution sources or census tracts that have the least tree covering and lay it over another map of our state that shows communities that were previously redlined, you would see a near complete match in most cases. So this slide also shows the Climate Act requirements to establish that criteria. And as you can see, it's, as we said before, it is based on the hazard socioeconomic data, but it's based on that, but it's not limited to that. It's also important to note that the language in the legislation, it's serving as an outline or a guide for how to identify disadvantaged communities. But what we're seeing and what you'll see throughout this presentation and what you see in the criteria, that is specifically to the DAC indicators, that was driven by the working group and their personally lived experiences and the lived experiences of the communities that they serve. Next slide, please. So once again, this is a legislative slide, and this slide explains the purpose of the disadvantaged communities criteria and how it will serve the state as we implement the Climate Act. So state agencies are required to prioritize greenhouse gas emissions and co-pollutant reductions in disadvantaged communities. And that includes DEC drafting regulations to meet the greenhouse gas emission limits required in the Climate Act. Many greenhouse gas emission sources are vehicles, pipelines, power plants, landfills, and factories. Also produce co-pollutants that damage the health and ecosystems of the areas where they're released or where they're carried in by the wind. There's also an accounting of investments, which I will touch on in the next slide. So next slide, please. So disadvantaged communities criteria must guide the state's clean energy efficiency investments. So a minimum of 35% and a goal of 40% of the benefits of clean energy efficiency spending made by the state, any state entity, will need to be realized in disadvantaged communities. So this requirement applies to all clean energy or energy efficiency investments related to the area, related to housing, workforce development, pollution reduction, power generation, transportation, and energy-related economic development. The benefits of these investments can include clean air, improved health, energy cost savings, and jobs. Making sure that these benefits accrue in disadvantaged communities is critical because communities that are disproportionately harmed by pollution and climate change are in this circumstance partially because they face barriers to accessing and owning clean energy services and technologies. So for awareness, the state is currently working to develop a process for measuring, tracking, and reporting on clean energy and energy efficiency investments and associated benefits pursuant to this act. Next slide, please. And with that said, I would like to turn the presentation over to Alex Dunn from Illume, who is one of our amazing technical partners who labored through this process alongside us. Alex.
Thanks, Alana. I'll be reviewing the details of the draft criteria, but before we jump into the content, I'd like to review some terminology. So next slide, please. In the next set of slides, we'll be talking about three main components, or three main items: components, factors, and indicators. Indicators are the individual data pieces, such as low birth weight or projected flooding risk, used to make up the criteria. These are then combined into factors that group indicators that fit into one category, such as potential pollution exposures. And these factors all fall into one of two buckets called components, either the environmental burden component, environmental burden and climate change risks component, or the population characteristics and health vulnerabilities component. Next slide. The development of the draft criteria included an assessment of more than 170 indicators for inclusion. And the indicators were assessed using a number of factors: the availability of sufficient high-quality granular statewide data, correlations to other indicators, ideally showing some overlap or correlation, but not so high that the indicator doesn't really add anything to the criteria, and the applicability to the goals and applications of the CLCPA definition. The Climate Justice Working Group was determined that having fewer, stronger indicators in the criteria would be a simpler and more transparent option. A long list of indicators doesn't necessarily mean a stronger definition or contribution to the disadvantaged communities or DAC definition. As I stated before, the Climate Justice Working Group identified 45 indicators that met the intention of the three pillars outlined in the Climate Act. 20 indicators related to environmental burdens and climate risks, and 25 indicators related to population characteristics and health vulnerabilities. The Geographic Dac Scoring approach used data from national and state sources. And these 45 indicators were grouped within their respective factors, and each factor again represents a concept that's referenced in the Climate Act. Factors were then combined into their respective components as a step to produce the final score, which we'll dive into in more detail in the coming slides. There are 3 factors within the environmental burden and climate change risk component score. Potential pollution exposures, which includes pollution indicators like traffic density, wastewater, and wastewater discharge. Land use and facilities associated with historical discrimination or disinvestment, which includes data like remediation sites and active landfills and vacancy rates. And potential climate change risks, which includes data on extreme heat and flooding. There's a lot of information on this slide, so I'm just going to give a second for everyone to take a look. Next slide, please. There are 4 factors within the population characteristics and health vulnerabilities component score. Income, education, and employment, including information on low and moderate incomes, single-parent households, and unemployment rates. Race, ethnicity, and language, which includes race and ethnicity data as well as limited English proficiency. Health impacts and sensitivities, including low birth weight and asthma emergency visits. Housing, energy, and communications, including renter-occupied homes, energy, poverty, and housing cost burden. The Climate Justice Working Group consistently reiterated that income, race, and ethnicity were the most important factors in the DAC score. Income, race, and ethnicity are important for many reasons, and the working group's lived experience being a main driver within their communities to show this, and decades of social science research showing that race, ethnicity, and income are the biggest predictors of health and environmental disparities. To come up with a factor score, a weighted average was produced of all the indicators percentile ranks for each factor of a census tract. Next slide, please. Before I continue, I want to note that we will have the opportunity to answer questions today following the presentation. But if you have any questions at this time, please enter them into the chat function. There were multiple steps to arrive at the final DAC score. First, all indicators were ranked on a percentile basis to determine the census tract score relative to all the other census tracts within New York State. That score was from 0 to 100. Then a weighted average of indicators within their respective factors was calculated. So each factor had their own score. And then a weighted average of each factor within the component was calculated. And lastly, the 2 components were multiplied by one another to attain a single score for each census tract across New York State to determine if it was included into the Geographic Dac criteria designation. This slide shows a visual breakdown of the scoring approach. As mentioned previously, to come up with a score, a weighted average was produced of all indicators percentile ranks for each factor of the census tract. Once the factor scores were calculated, those scores were added to one another to produce the score of an overall component. That's the long rectangular box. The 2 component scores were then multiplied together to create a single score for each census tract. Please note that the climate change risk factor is the only factor with a 2 times weight, so that the climate change factor is equal importance to the 2 environmental factors within the environmental burdens component. Next slide, please. To ensure an equitable distribution of DACs across the state, the Climate Justice Working Group decided upon a combined scoring approach, calculating scores statewide and also regionally, New York City versus the rest of the state. And then the top 27% of those scores, either statewide or regionally, were designated as a geographic DAC. This process ensured that non-New York City census tracts were not left out of the Geographic Dac criteria designation because of the high correlation of New York City census tracts have with many of the indicators included in the criteria. There's no formula to the percent of census tracts that were identified as DACs. The Climate Justice Working Group considered the following factors in establishing this value. The CLCPA benefit spending goal of 40% and targeting a threshold of less than 40% within this designation may encourage greater than proportional share of spending to benefit those DACs. The second consideration was ground truthing. Climate Justice Working Group members spent considerable time looking at their communities and identified census tracts that would likely be DACs. A higher threshold, say 40% or more, captures more of those communities, but it also begins to capture gentrified or gentrifying areas where not everyone needs as much support. And finally, room for review and expansion. The working group determined that it would be better to start with a smaller share of DACs and add rather than trying to remove DACs later. As a result of these considerations, the Climate Justice Working Group voted to designate 35% of census tracts as DACs. Next slide, thank you. The goal of the Climate Justice Working Group was to identify census tracts across New York State as DACs. And to do this, there were a couple additional census tracts that needed to be added. And the working group used a multi-step approach to do this. Using each census tract's overall score, as I mentioned earlier, to calculate the percentile rank of statewide and regionally, the tracts that scored the top 27% of their regional or statewide percentile rank were selected to achieve the overall goal of 35% of tracts designated. The percentile rank scoring threshold of 27% was determined to achieve that final 35% designation threshold. Next, automatically including 19 census tracts that are federally designated reservation territory or state-recognized nation-owned land. We recognize that indigenous and tribal areas are sovereign territories that as citizens or residents of those areas, nations have the rights to determine the level of inclusion in this process. What we're looking at here is a recognition of the unique histories of racism and discrimination experienced by Indigenous people in the DAC definition we are establishing. By including Indigenous peoples in the DAC definition, we are establishing a baseline for inclusion should individual nations and tribal governments determine to engage in government-to-government consultation regarding this process. The third and final set of tracts added were designated tracts with few census-defined household or population data as DACs. And if their environmental burdens and climate change risks was at the top 27% of their regional or statewide percentile ranks, they were added in. They did not have sufficient population or health data to include that component score within their census tracts. This resulted in a final listing of 1,793 tracts designated as DACs. This slide shows a percentage of geographic DACs across the designated regions in comparison to the general and low-income population shares in the state. As you can see, using this methodology, most geographic DACs are in New York City across the 5 boroughs, and the second largest percentage of DACs is in the Mid-Hudson region. Next slide, please. In the process of determining a geographic criteria, the Climate Justice Working Group recognized that there are low-income households across New York State that aren't located within geographic DACs. And this is primarily due to the fact that poverty in upstate and rural areas are more dispersed than in downstate. To address this, the working group elected to include a low-income households designation located anywhere in the state for the purpose of investing or directing clean energy programs. Next slide. To determine what was considered low income, the Climate Justice Working Group examined several options, including households in the annual income with an annual income at or below the federal poverty line, 60% area median income, and moderate income households. From there, the Climate Justice Working Group determined that the inclusion of households at or below 60% of the state median income, or households that qualified for low-income energy programs, would capture the those households that are most in need that fall outside of geographic DACs. The inclusion of low-income households outside of the geographic DACs only applies to the purposes of allocating state clean energy and energy efficiency investments. This slide shows the impact of in each region where the low-income designation is added. The addition of the designation allows for an increase in the number of households considered under the DAC definition in rural areas of the state. Again, the designation of low-income households is for the purpose of informing clean energy and energy efficiency benefits and investments only. You can see that the rural regions in North have a larger proportion of low-income households added. And now I'm going to hand it back to Alana for a brief overview of the criteria.
Thanks, Alex. Thank you. So, as we stated earlier, the Climate Justice Working Group spent a significant amount of time developing the draft criteria and voted unanimously to release the draft criteria in December of last year. So the draft criteria, if you'll see what they voted on directly. So the draft criteria will include the 45 indicators in the criteria for environmental exposures and burdens and climate risks and the socio-demographic and characteristics and health outcomes. They also voted on the scoring methodology for the census tracts that Alex went over. The inclusion of 35% of New York State Census tracts as geographic DACs, the inclusion of low-income households located anywhere in the state for accounting and investment benefits only, and the definition of low-income households as households with an income at or below 60% of the state median income. They also voted on to make sure that we're coming back annually to review the DAC criteria, and this is also in the legislation. And just as a reminder, we are going to have an opportunity to ask questions following the presentation, but if you have any questions at this time, please feel free to enter them into the chat function and make sure you are sending them to all the panelists so we can all see them. We also have lots of materials on our website, summary documents that provide a short overview of what we covered today, a full technical documentation that goes into great detail about every indicator, the methodology, the data used, and the indicators that were considered but ultimately not used. And on that same page, there is an interactive map where you can see the draft disadvantaged communities statewide, as well as non-DACs that might be close by. Next slide, please. And so as I mentioned, here are the resources. Just I'm gonna leave those up there just for a couple seconds, just so folks can, see them. We're gonna mention them over and over again. And as a reminder, you can submit written comments through July 7th. By email, by mail, and they're weighted the same as making an oral statement. So if you're not able to make any of the hearings that we plan on holding, you can still submit your comments. Just going to give you a sec just so everybody can see that if they need to write it down. And now I'm going to turn this presentation over to Tyler Picard, who is going to discuss our disadvantaged communities maps. Sorry, next slide. Tyler.
Thanks, Alana, and hello, everyone. My name is Tyler Picard, and I'm a project manager with NYSERDA's Energy and Climate Equity team. And I'm here today to help walk you through the maps that were developed to help with the public input on the disadvantaged community criteria. So I'll be taking the screen share right now. Bear with me for 1 second. Okay, so you can access these maps by going to the climate.ny.gov website. And when you go to that website, you'll see a small box that says Disadvantaged Communities Criteria. When you click that box, there will be a hyperlink for the interactive maps, and that is the same location where you can find all the technical documentation that Alana alluded to. So after you load into the web page, you'll be taken to a map that you see on the screen here. And what this shows are the draft disadvantaged community, or the census tracts that meet the draft disadvantaged community criteria as shaded in purple. So before we jump into how to view census tracts and all the details, I just want to spend a few minutes to go over the map's functionality. So when you hover over the map, you'll see a toolbar appear on the left-hand side. Users can click the plus sign to zoom into the map. And do note it may take a few seconds to load between usage. There's a lot of data behind this map. So there it goes. And to zoom back out, you can hit the minus sign here. One tool I would probably recommend instead of using the plus and minus, if you go to this small arrow here, additional tools will pop up. There's the zoom area tool, which looks like a magnifying glass in a small box. If you click this tool, you can left click and drag over an area. So I'll just drag over this area, for example. And that will zoom you in directly to your selection. So it's a bit easier to find particular neighborhoods or areas if you use that function. Now, once you're zoomed in to move around, again, looking at this additional tool option, the pan tool, which is arrows pointing 4 ways. If you select this tool, you can move around the map. Again, it will take a second between moving to repopulate. So at any point in time while you're going around the map, you can go back to your original selection by hitting this zoom home option. And this will take you right back to where you originally started. So one last thing before jumping into viewing the tracks is that above this toolbar, you'll see a search map magnifying glass here. And this will allow users to look up an area by zip code or municipality town area. So just for example, we'll put in Albany zip code 12201. If you put that in and enter it, it will go directly to the area. Again, hitting the home button to go back to our default view. So with functionality out of the way, I want to spend a few minutes to also review how to actually review the individual census tracts. So if you just hover over a census tract, and we'll use this for an example, a small pop-up box will appear with a number of different data points. So one thing to note, in the large bold text there, it will tell you if the census tract is designated as a draft disadvantaged community or not. Secondly, you'll see after census tract on the first line there, a numeric string. That's the census tract geo-identification number, and that could be used in our technical documentation to kind of cross-reference census tract if you so please. The information will also show the town, municipality, or city name if available to the US Census. So in our example here, it says this tract covering Elba Village. And then following that, it will also give you the population of the census tract. One last thing, you'll see it shows the comparison of the overall environmental burden and population score as a percentage relative to other New York State tracts. So in our example here, for this tract, the environmental burden combined score is higher than 60% of tracts statewide, and the population vulnerability score is higher than 50% of census tracts statewide. Excuse me. So when you actually click on a tract, a table will populate below the map, and this table will show all of the indicators that how that tract scored for. And just to note, the indicators are sorted by component. So you'll see in the blue on the left, the population characteristics and vulnerability, and the orange on the right, the environmental burdens and climate change risk indicators. Additionally, the indicators are sorted by factors within their components. So you'll see all of the health impacts and burden indicators, for example, here are bucketed together, and all the land use and historical discrimination, for example, are bucketed together here. So these are all the indicators that go into this factor. If you hover over the percentile score for any of the indicators, another pop-up box will appear. And one thing to note here is that a description of the indicator will pop up. It's a summary of the indicator to give you information on what it represents. However, I will note that our technical documentation does have more developed descriptions of the indicator, including data sources. So if you are interested in that, definitely want to check out the documentation. So one last thing to note on the map, you'll notice if you look at the right-hand side here, there's a select layer to display section. When you load in, you're on the draft DAC layer automatically, but if you click this individual indicators function, a drop-down box will appear, and you are then able to select any of the indicators that go into the draft disadvantaged community criteria. And by selecting one, it will repopulate the map to show the percentile values for those census tracts across the state. So a good example would be if we put burden traffic diesel trucks, for example, we click this indicator, give the map a minute. it will repopulate the map, and now the dark purple areas are the highest census tracts with percentile values of traffic diesel trucks. So that's everything for the map. I will be passing it back to Alana now. Thank you.
Thanks, Tyler. Next slide, please. So we're going to be taking questions now. So the question procedure, if you're online, we want you to use the raise hand function and we'll unmute you. If you're calling into a WebEx, into the WebEx, please press *3 to raise your hand. If you'd rather not ask a question out loud, please feel free to use the chat function. Those of you who've already used it, we've seen your questions. If you have additional questions, please feel free to enter more. And also remember, this is an education session, not a public hearing. So if you do want to make a comment, please submit those online via our website or through the mail. So do we have anyone who would like to ask a question first, or shall I just? Okay. So do we have anyone who's raised their hand, or should I just ask a question from the chat?
There's no hands raised at this time, Alana, so if you want to go to the questions that have been in the chat.
Sure. So the first question, is there any consideration of cumulative environmental impacts that may be exacerbated by climate change impacts? Good question. There has been discussion of in the Climate Act, there is a discussion in Section 7.3 that states that any action taken on by the state cannot disproportionately burden disadvantaged communities. In making the determination of whether or not disadvantaged communities are burdened, there will need to be consideration of what the environmental impacts of the specific actions are. As for whether or not we'll be specifically using cumulative impacts, I can't say at this time, but there definitely will be a process for determining whether or not areas of disadvantaged communities under 7.3 are overburdened. So in discussions with the Climate Justice Working Group and the Action Council, apologies. Yep, no, we'll just be, so we will be discussing that and determining exactly how we will be determining whether or not communities are being burdened. But at this time, I don't know if we're going to be using cumulative impact analysis. And the next question is, when do we anticipate defining benefit and related metrics? The answer is we're currently in discussions with the Climate Justice Working Group and the Climate Action Council. And we've established that we're going to be tracking direct program investments as the primary benefit metric that's tracked. However, there are additional benefits and impacts that are associated with these investments that we want to be able to track as well. So state agencies are currently working to identify them, and as well as ways to measure them and track them and, report on them. And, we're creating a framework, and we're going to be re-engaging with the Climate Justice Working Group to discuss how that framework is going to look. So as a part of that, we'll also engage with stakeholders on, whether or not that's how it works, and to understand how clean energy and energy investment benefits can actually benefit their communities. Okay. I did see a question previously about, somebody inquired whether or not folks who live in disadvantaged communities, who don't live in disadvantaged communities or in draft disadvantaged communities, should be commenting on the draft criteria. We do want wide consideration of the draft criteria. So if you don't live in a disadvantaged community, but you serve a disadvantaged community, or if you, as the person said, and I don't want to say your name necessarily, but if you live in you don't live in a disadvantaged community, but you believe that your community should be considered a disadvantaged community based on certain indicators or effects, please definitely send comments in so that we, they'll be considered. We definitely want to make sure that we are considering all elements. If we might have missed information, we're not perfect. So if there are sources or data sources out there that we could use to determine that your area should be a disadvantaged community, you can definitely make us aware of those. Even if folks fall outside of the map, we definitely want to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to comment. There are some communities that are considered to be disadvantaged communities, but that are considered to be environmental justice communities, but aren't disadvantaged communities. If you live in one of those and you feel as if there are other factors that should be considered, absolutely let us know that. And another question is, how are existing DEC rules taken into account? Guess I'm going to need a little bit more context for that. Are we talking about existing environmental justice rules, existing regulations? If we could, and I don't know if you would like to.
Maybe while that person is providing more context here, there was another question that we had received that was meant directly to the host. I'm happy to read that.
Oh, sure. Thanks.
Here. The question was, are there any other titles being considered instead of disadvantaged communities, perhaps historically underserved communities? And so for that, we certainly understand the sensitivity around terminology. However, in context of implementing the Climate Act, we need to use the terminology that's written in the actual law. However, agencies can and should think about how to refer to frontline and otherwise just disadvantaged communities in their programs. We also had another question in the chat. When do we anticipate defining benefit and related metrics? So the response to that one, in discussions with the Climate Justice Working Group and Climate Action Council, we have established that we'll be tracking direct program investments as the primary benefit metric that's tracked. However, there are additional benefits and impacts associated with these investments that we will want and need to be able to track. So state agencies are working to identify these metrics as well as how to measure, track, and report on this framework now. And we'll be re-engaging with the Climate Justice Working Group to discuss this benefits framework in the next couple of months. So as part of this work, the state will also engage with stakeholders to understand how clean energy efficiency investments can benefit their community. So stay tuned for more on that, and thank you for that question.
I see a question about the comments. What weight will comments hold on final criteria? So as we stated before, comments submitted will be reviewed and assessed by the Climate Justice Working Group, and those will inform any modifications to the draft as the Climate Justice Working Group finalizes the criteria. Thank you for that question. Another question, are these presentations being recorded? Yes, the education sessions are being recorded and they are going to be available on the Climate Act website in the coming days. So stay tuned for that. Thank you. Okay, we have another question. Can we give an example of how local municipalities use the disadvantaged communities map? And will agencies use the map for future project funding during the CFA process? So the disadvantaged communities criteria is expected to be used by the state to help to mitigate burdens on communities and by state agencies to guide our energy and energy efficiency investments as required under the Climate Act. Municipalities and other other government may use the criteria and the maps, but they're not directly, but municipalities and government entities that are not state agencies are not directly subject to the Climate Act investment requirements. Thank you for the question.
And we do have a hand raised, Alana. If I can
sure.
I'll unmute Peter Bailey. You're unmuted to ask your question.
You mentioned, Alana, that there are communities designated as EJ communities that do not fall under the DAC communities.
Yes.
Could you elaborate on that?
Oh, sure. So environmental justice communities are determined using census block data and determined by income. So we really only use those two indicators to determine whether or not a specific census block in New York State is a potential environmental justice area. The disadvantaged communities criteria is based on 45 indicators. So that information, while critical, also is sort of expanded upon. So once you drill down, you might have a community that meets the criteria of being a potential environmental justice community by either being a majority minority community or by, being at or below the poverty level, but might not meet other climate related or socioeconomic indicators that were selected by the Climate Justice Working Group.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah. So we have another question. How were existing DEC rules taken into account? That's the question I asked for a little bit of elaboration on. So the criteria included various factors that relate to environmental exposures, such as whether areas include active landfills, municipal waste combustors, and other facilities regulated by DEC. But under the Climate Act, DEC is going to be implementing additional regulations for to further the required emissions reduction limits by 2024. Thank you. Another question we have, was drinking water infrastructure considered during the process? Wastewater discharge is included as an indicator under the environmental pollution factors. If folks have additional questions, if you could just raise your hand and we'll unmute you and you can ask your questions. Thanks.
Okay, we do have another hand raised right now, and I'll unmute Lynn Gregory. Go ahead, you're unmuted.
Thank you very much for taking my question. I'm just wondering if your DACs include the designation of any sanctuary cities in your state, and if they're given any sort of priority or status or anything. And the secondary question would be for the information that you're putting together, is this going to be used in a larger regional sense, like New England or Middle Atlantic state sense, or even a national sense for a climate review?
Okay, thank you for your question. I don't believe, Alex, if you want to jump in on that, I don't believe we use sanctuary cities as an indicator. That is not one of the indicators that we used, correct?
No, we did not use sanctuary cities. There are a lot of overlap between correlations between sanctuary cities and other indicators we do have in there, though.
And as for the second part of your question, whether or not there are plans to expand this regionally or even nationally, the Climate Act really, at this point, applies to New York State. So it really is focused on the goals of the Climate Act as related to New York.
Okay, thank you. I just wondered if you were planning to maybe open it up as a tool for the other states in the country or in the region.
I do not believe that there are any plans for that at this time.
Okay, thank you very much.
Just want to reiterate here that this is an open comment period that goes until July 7th. So if you do have specific recommendations for changes to make to this draft criteria, please submit that as a comment so that we can, and the Climate Justice Working Group can consider.
And we do have another question here about whether there are any plans to mitigate the impacts of these investments in terms of raising property values and desirability that could lead to gentrification of disadvantaged areas. The intention is to focus on the benefits of clean energy and energy investment, efficiency investments on frontline communities. And it's to facilitate a just transition to our clean energy future. So we understand that there may be some potential unintended impacts, such as gentrification, and we expect that programs and investments will need to consider how to mitigate these potential consequences where possible. And there's another question here on any of the metrics that were mentioned during the presentation, particularly related to the mapping available as shapefiles or GIS data that is downloadable from the New York State GIS Clearinghouse. Yes, there are data and indicators and shapefiles that are available on Open New York. You can find that link to the data sets on the Disadvantaged Communities Climate Act webpage. And we have another question here. Was diabetes data considered in one of the 170 indicators? If yes, why was it not included in the 45? And if not, why not?
Can jump
Alex,
in on that.
Yep. Do you want to jump in on that? Yep.
Yeah, diabetes was raised, and it's a really important indicator, and we did review it. One of the current working group kind of issues or that we looked at was the fact that there are privacy concerns with the data that we could get for that. So it is a high priority data point that the working group hope to review in the future and find a way to include if possible.
Are there any additional questions? If you do, raise your hand. And again, if you are calling into the WebEx on your phone, press *3 to raise your hand. Yes, *3. Okay.
Alana, we do have another hand raised,
Yep.
so I'll go ahead and
okay.
unmute. Linda Shaw, you are unmuted.
Yes, hi. My question has to do with the former definition of end zones in the brownfield cleanup program, and now the definition of disadvantaged communities is coming into that program. What we found is that end zones, which were just based on the high poverty, high unemployment, missed a lot of the brownfield sites because we learned that the Census Bureau puts industrial sites in their own census tract. Did you have to deal with that issue that, you know, a lot of the census tracts that have the polluting facilities are next to the high poverty and high unemployment census tracts? Or was there any way, you know, recognition that there's certain census tracts that sort of only include the industrial sites that may be the polluting facilities?
It's a good question. It actually seems closer to a substantive comment, and absolutely something that we would like you to submit as a comment on the disadvantaged communities criteria. I don't believe, and that's something that we can definitely answer through that. I don't believe I think that's definitely a substantive comment that you should submit.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I did see a question in here. Is there some data available at the census block level? Some census tracts cover a long geographic area. Alex, I think that's a good question for you on tracts versus blocks.
Yeah, this was something that was discussed at the working group, and the data are not available at the block group level due to the potential for larger errors found in the block group. The working group decided to use census tracts to minimize that error, but it was a balancing act. Also to add that there were some data points that were not available at the census block level, but were at the census tract level.
Thanks, Alex.
Just again, reiterating here that if you have, you know, substantive comments about these decisions, like the one that Alex just went over now about using census tract versus block groups, that it would be helpful to submit that as a comment on the official record so that we can deliberate and see that with the climate justice working group as before we finalize this criteria.
Are there any additional questions? Are there any questions that we might have missed that folks would like to possibly raise up again? Well, if there are no more questions, next slide, please. Sorry, it's already there. Just here again, just one more time, are the resources available. As we said before, written comments, maybe on the draft disadvantaged communities criteria, may be submitted until July 7th of this year. Information is available on our website. You can also send written comments through the mail to our email address, and you can also send them to our email address at daccomments@dec.ny.gov. We absolutely will be holding public hearings on the draft criteria, and we hope to have that information for you very soon. I want to thank everybody for coming to this information session. We'll be holding another information session on Tuesday, the 19th, from 6 to 8 p.m. That information is also available on the climate.ny.gov website. Once again, thank you everyone for coming. Please submit comments, and we hope to hear from you soon.
Okay, we'll go off record now.
Thank you.